We're going to cover a range of things. Has anyone ever heard of the Commission for Children other than the Working with Children check? Does anyone know that we do things other than that? Yes? Good that yes, one or two, yes. There's a whole range of functions which I'll show in a second, but effectively the Commission, under the legislation that is in place since 1998, obligates the organisation by law to come out and educate and facilitate training programs to try and achieve what we call a child-safe, child-friendly organisation. So essentially the government requires us as an organisation to go out and provide guidance and resources and downloadable tools where it supports you to allow children to feel safe and have a friendly environment. We don't endorse any organisation, so we don't have the ability, and we're looking at accreditation currently in our structure, but we don't currently have the ability to say there is a child-safe, child-friendly organisation. Mainly from the sort of the theoretical point of view that if we endorse and rubber stamp an organisation and then harm occurs to a child, not only does it drag the government into that sort of concern, but it also means an organisation may rest in their laurels and say, well, we've got endorsement or we've achieved that standard, so therefore we're going to turn our back on the culture. What we try and achieve is a child-safe, child-friendly organisation essentially is one that places kids' safety as the paramount concern, and you're regularly engaging in building a culture within your organisation to understand what the risks are, and risks emerge. It's not a static thing. Facebook is another great example of risks that are arising. We have lots of organisations contacting us and say, do we allow our staff to be friends with kids on Facebook? So your members and your volunteers and your staff have a young 14, 15-year-old who's a volunteer, and then they friend request one of the people in your organisation. If you don't have something in place for that, quite often people will enact their own professional standards. I know I would sort of lightly ignore it and say, oh, well, that makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. But the big thing we try and avoid and try and prevent in any sort of scenario incident, we don't like ignorance. So we don't like an organisation to be ignorant and say we never foresaw that was going to be a risk, because there's lots of information out there as to what risks are. And my biggest bugbear is when someone's investigated, they say, I didn't know that was inappropriate. I didn't know that a child would feel uncomfortable by me talking about sex or striking them violently or dragging them by their shirt or making them stand outside in the weather. And people will tend to rely on ignorance if you haven't given them guidance up front and you haven't explained to them what the expectations are within your organisation when you have children on site. So we'll talk about child-friendly, child-safe, child-friendly. We talk a lot about what we call proactive situational prevention. And it ranges from the environments in which your physical activities are occurring, so the buildings that you occupy, the excursions that you do, whether you have vehicles that involve transport, whether you travel with children, all those sorts of scenarios, but also what backs it up in regard to your policies and procedures, your codes of conduct, your situational prevention. One of the key areas of situational prevention is training. So actually letting people know regularly what you expect from them when children are on site. Those sorts of scenarios do add to the likelihood of you having less chance of the child being harmed. We don't give any sort of assurances of safety and say if you adopt our best practice strategies, you're guaranteed to not have harm. But what you always need to be mindful of is an individual harms a child, not an organisation. So no matter what happens within a sector or industry, it's an individual, or maybe more than one individual, who goes on to harm a child. It's not an organisation that has the ability to do that. But your organisation is the one that prevents the likelihood of it occurring by layering risk management and having a whole range of things in place. I'll talk about the new Working with Children check, as I said before. We'll give you a little bit of a summary. But if you do have any questions about that, come and see me during the break or at the end of the session, and we can give you a range of fact sheets and resources. The Commission does several things. We're a small agency, I think. We're currently at about 76 staff, and that's growing quite significantly for the new check. But our key area of responsibility for government is promoting and providing safe and friendly environments for kids. We do a lot of dialogue with young people. We have a youth advisory council who are essentially elected or nominated young people in between the ages of, I believe it's 12 and 17, and they come and meet with the Commissioner, and now we're under a Guardian, Commissioner and Guardian, and they meet with them and discuss what goes on in kids' lives at this current stage, what New South Wales is like to live in. They do a whole range of research. Last year, for the first time, the actual youth group did their own form of research. They collated over 1,100 surveys from their peers talking about 5 key areas, essentially after school. So how do they get to and from school? What do they do after school? What impacts are in place or roadblocks or difficulties are in place to prevent them from doing what they'd like to do after school? And typically, for example, most of the respondents said, my parents don't let me do what I'd like to do after school. So it was good feedback as to do we need to do some work with parents to say, do you understand the abilities of a 14-year-old or 15-year-old and how independent they can be, and giving some guidance. So we have lots of research and resources online. We do statistical data. If you are looking for, I know a lot of volunteer organisations are looking for government grants. If you have stakeholders or kids who are involved in programs between the ages of 9 and 14, we've got an excellent resource online called the Middle Years, and it tells you how many children there are in New South Wales in between those age brackets, historically what the demographics are, all the things they do, what are the real versus perceived risks, all sorts of things. We heavily promote kids' involvement in decision making, and it really ties in with today's session, because effectively what our organisation stands for, and I can be quite honest and say prior to joining the organisation, when I previously worked at Sport and Recreation, I heard about this kids' participation and citizen me and involving children in decision making, and I sort of looked at it with a bit of a grain of salt, and I thought, how much could a child provide? I come from very much a child protection background, so I'm sort of thinking, when we're talking about harm to children, how effective would it be for a child to be involved in that decision making? But in watching it in action, it's very, very sound. It's very, very appropriate. My perception as to what would be a nice, comfortable environment for a 12-year-old is probably going to be very different for a 12-year-old. So if you ask them and you ask me, I would come up with a different strategy or plan as to oppose that young person. We've done lots of work with the disability sector and sports with their inclusion programs, and the best advice we give those sectors and industries is when you have a young child who joins your organisation, or a young person, or even a client or customer or member, and you're looking to engage them and include them in your activities, simply ask them how it should be modified. Don't think that you're an expert to modify a program or activity because you know your sport or your pursuit or your art or your music. The best person to speak to is that child who's lived with that disability their entire life. They'll be able to tell you what their capabilities are. They'll be able to tell you the way in which you can modify those sorts of activities and programs. We focus heavily for ourselves in our team on kids being involved and the child safe, child friendly, and they're quite interlinked. If children feel comfortable and safe and encouraged to raise concerns, your organisation is in a good place in regard to preventing secrecy, preventing colluding and grooming and conditioning of children. The way in which people target children for sexual misconduct or sexual harm historically is by confusing or tricking the child into believing there's no benefit in raising this alarm. So if you can establish a culture within your organisation that you're encouraging young people to join the organisation, but your rights will be 100% supported just like anyone else, that is a good start. When I joined Sport and Recreation in my previous job, I was advised up front on the day that I joined the organisation that the child protection policy internally says that as a member of staff, even if I see my general manager at the facility that I work in, the CEO of that facility, if I see them raise their voice to the child inappropriately, physically engage with the child inappropriately, be sexually inappropriate, I must notify head office as of the first day I started my job. Not, let's go through induction for a week, let's teach you how to do the job, let's mentor you with someone else, and then eventually we'll get to policy and procedure around things like reporting concerns. It was given to me up front on the first day. And it's certainly cemented in my mind there's a culture within this organisation of transparency and openness. If you see anyone do something wrong, if you see anyone treat anyone else inappropriately, you need to raise that. It's a requirement within the job, and you'll be protected in that regard. So that sort of culture is a very good way from preventing someone from trying to become part of your organisation, trying to build a reputation and rapport within the organisation, a bit of security, and then taking advantage by going outside professional standards. If everyone knows that we're all watching each other, our kids are empowered to raise a concern or alarm, that's a really good base to work off, because it is quite hard for people to create that secrecy from that point of view. Now's where we start to ask a few questions.